So before we get started with our techniques, let's start talking about the markers. So Tombow markers are a dye-based ink or water-based. They have a fine tip on one end and they have a brush tip on the other end. So these markers are closest to the markers that we grew up with as kids. So when you're starting, say, to do card making and stuff like that, and you want to color in images, these are a great one to start with simply because you don't have to learn how to color. However, having said that, they're not my favorite way of coloring for cards, simply because you have to color fairly quickly. Because of the water-based nature of the markers, they start to tear up and pill the paper quite quickly. I'm not sure if actually you can see it on the camera. That might have been a bit too dark a color. You might not be able to see it at all. But so you have to, when you're coloring images, you have to color fairly quickly. So all of those darker bits in here are little bits of the paper that have come off while I'm coloring. So they're great to start because you don't have to learn how to color, but you do have to color fairly quickly unless you want the paper torn up when you're making your cards. The one thing to know is when closing the cap, especially this side on your marker, make sure you hear that click. I worked in a scrapbooking store for 12 years, and the only reason any of these ever dried on the shelf when they were new was because someone had taken the lid off of them and not completely close them. So that's something to that's something to make sure that you're doing. When you're closing them, make sure that you hear that little click. So while they're not my favorite way of coloring, I am going to show you how to color in the first video. There's some fantastic techniques that you can do with them, and they're a lot of fun to play with in that respect. So the inks that we're going to be using throughout this class, I'm going to be using Memento ink when I want to stamp an image and just color it, but not use any moisture. Anytime I'm going to be using moisture or water and I'm stamping before I'm using the markers, I'm going to use the Stays On ink because it's a permanent ink. It's not going to go anywhere. And then when I want to do some embossing, I'm going to use my Versamark ink. So some of them you'll see me doing, some of them you won't see me doing. There's a couple other pads that I'm going to be using just for things afterwards, but I'll tell you when I'm using them, and there's no other reason for it's not something that I'm going to be using regularly throughout the class. All right, so without further ado, oh, 1 second. Before I forget, when you're storing these markers, they should be stored laying down. And that way you've got the ink going both ways to the fine tip and the brush tip. If you start storing them sticking up, often people will have issues with one end going dry. So when you're storing them, I have mine, of course I have the bin completely filled with other stuff, but I have mine sitting in a bin with other markers and stuff like that, and they always get stored flat. So just something to keep in mind. There is a storage case that you can buy that the markers all fit into little slots, and I would take that case and I would store it flat as well. So without further ado, let's go to the next video and our first technique.